Hello, everybody. David Brenna here, Dry Fly Pro. Very excited today to have an interview with quite a wonderful gentleman. Jack Dennis has been around the fly fishing world forever and ever, as most of you probably know. And he does most of his guide service in Wyoming, and I want to ask him some questions about that. But I have to ask this first one just because it crosses paths with my life in an interesting way. So what I'm talking about is Kurt Gowdy and Joe Brooks. And Kurt Gowdy and Joe Brooks, of course, debuted a program called The American Sportsman. At the time, I was 12 years old, and I had just received my first fly rod from my father, who knew nothing about fly fishing, so he couldn't help me. And I looked at that thick line, and I said, you can't tie a fly onto that kind of thick line. How's this going to work? So I had happened to tune in the next day or two. It was a Saturday, and I watched The American Sportsman, the debut episode. And they were fishing in Argentina. And even though it was an old black and white color television set, I could tell that there was something between the fly line and the fly. And I went, aha. I later learned that it was called a leader, but that was what really got me figuring out how to tackle fly fishing. So I just thought I'd share that with you. Tell me about Kurt Gowdy.
Well, first of all, I met Kurt in interviewing for a basketball announcing job at his radio station in Laramie. I had done junior college basketball in a town called Powell, Wyoming. Small college. It turned out 4 guys into the NBA. A couple of them are in the Basketball Hall of Fame, and I was there during that time. Johnny Johnson, who played for both Seattle and for Portland, was for one semester my college roommate, because they couldn't find any, hate to say it, white person that would room in the athletic department with a black guy. And growing up in a family where my father was a pilot, and also was the pilot for the Kansas City Athletics in Kansas City, where I went to grade school. And so I grew up around blacks, and there was no problem. And so I did the games, and I thought, well, I'd see if I can get a job. Well, I didn't get the job. And I came back. Randall Kaufman and I'd had to stay in the area because I was in the Army Reserves. And so I was going to go back to college and play baseball. I played in the Army when I got called up to active duty. And I was going to go back and do it. And Randall and I said, let's go to Jackson. And we walked into this shop that I'd known about because I'd spent all my summers in Jackson. Jackson Hole. I was born in Jackson Hole. My grandfather had a ranch there. And so he said, look, we need flies tied and we need guides. Well, Randall had no idea what guiding fly fishermen meant, but he knew how to tie flies. And so that fall we tied flies in there. Okay. And I started guiding because I had done it in the summers before that. And Randall and I had this great idea. We're going to start a fly tying operation. Well, we started doing that, and it got to be 40 below in December, and that was the end of Randall. He went to Oregon, met up with Dennis Black, and we kept tying, and Dennis Black eventually founded Umpqua Feather Merchants. Now, I know there's a long way to go around, but during the time, I ended up starting the fly tying operation, and the shop that hired her said, look, if you can make a go of it for a few years, I'll sell you my shop. And so we started the guiding operation, not really much of a shop. And a friend of mine said, look, you need to go to the first Trout Unlimited Colorado meeting. Kurt Gowdy's going to be there. And I said, man, when I was a kid, I wanted to do an American Sportsman show. And I thought, man, if I could get there and talk to Kurt Gowdy, I could convince him to do American Sportsman show. And man, I was just like 20, 21. I gathered up enough money and people owed me to buy a ticket on Frontier Airlines to fly to Denver. And I got, somehow I wrangled a ticket to get in there. And we had a man that knew him very well that owned a newspaper in Jackson. And he said, he saw me there and he said, Jack, come on. Hey, I want to introduce you to Kurt Gowdy. And Kurt goes, and said that and said, I'm Jack Dennis. And he goes, hey, didn't you interview for a job? I said, yeah, but I'm a fishing guide now. He goes, good choice, good choice. He said, I'm thinking about doing an American Sportsman show in Jackson Hole. Can you do it? We were lifelong friends from then on. His life revolved around my life. He taught me everything. He was my mentor about doing television shows. We did 5 American Sportsman shows together. He actually offered me a job to go back and be one of the producers back in New York. My wife, who came from New York, said, no way in the world are you going to leave here to go to New York. But we ended up doing the show, which was called the I'm trying to remember what the name of the show was, what they called it. It was Fishing in Jackson Hole. It was the highest rated show that they ever did.
One of the things that's absolutely intriguing about you is that you have been, in some respects, on the forefront of a lot of the things that have happened in fly fishing over the many decades. I'm a little nervous about the state of the fly fishing community. A lot of these young kids, they're not behaving the way I did when I was younger. And I'm not saying that our generation was better, but they have a different attitude about it. Have you observed that?
Well, interesting, because I have a grandson who's just became a guide. He's 18 and he's going to college. And I said, I won't help you unless you're going to college, because every one of my guides in Jackson had a college degree. And I said, if you're gonna do this, I want you to get your college degree. And he's doing that. And so I get a little insight into the younger people. And
Okay.
I find it very interesting that both my grandsons listened to the music of the 70s and the Beatles and
It was the best music there was.
it's cool, man. It's cool. So, I've tried to understand this, and, I had a great chance to watch the transformation of fly fishing when I started coaching the world fly fishing team. I had a chance to deal with the kids that were very young in their 20s, and now many of them, like George Daniels and oh gosh, I could just have to think all the kids that went in and became fly fishing experts now. I think the perception, they're more interested in doing it than talking about it or reading about it. Now, video is a great media for them, because they can express themselves. And, these kids grew up with social media. And of course, right now, I want to say, used to say airwaves. I don't know what you call it now, but from the internet and beyond, they're getting their words out, and they want to go places. And I had one of the most interesting young man, 20 years old, Jeff Courier, came in and said, look, I want a job here. And I said, well, you're awful young. He says, well, my job is, I want to become the manager of this fly shop. And 27 years of running our fly shop. And I took him and gave him opportunities, and he grasped it. And now he said to me, holy cow, I'm getting old now. He's over 50. And I said, yeah. And he used to always say, when are you going to retire? When are you going to retire? So I can get in there and so I got a lot of insight from, and he was, by the way, on the U.S. fly fishing team. And the team that I coached are now seniors, and they just won the senior world championship.
Awesome.
And they were all the guys that I coached. So it only took 20 years, but we got there. We finally got to the goal.
It seems to me that you're somewhat cloistered in people who are passionate about the sport as you and I are. What I sadly encounter in giving casting lessons and working with folks, off of various internet platforms, is that an awful lot of them don't go to the trouble of trying to understand the history and the amazing things that happened. I tell this story. When I started fly fishing, there were no internet, obviously. And so what I would do, once I had a driver's license, I would borrow the family car and I'd head for some fishing water. I lived in Minnesota at the time, and I fished the area called the Driftless. Great trout fishing. I moved out here in '75, but what I did is, because there was no other options, there weren't even any fly fishing magazines, for crying out loud. I would do two things on a fishing trip. Obviously go fishing, but I'd also stop in as many small towns as I could, look into their library and find out if I could find a book about fly fishing. And that's how I learned the history. When I first started tying flies on videos, I tied classic and traditional patterns, and then I often would tie the upgrade. And I've been shocked at how many people, for instance, didn't know where the Royal Coachman came from, or the Coachman itself. So there's such rich history, and part of what I like a lot about fly fishing is that it has a great history. And I think you're part of that, and I like to think I am as well.
Well, I'll tell you, there are more fly fishing books in the world of sports.
That's right.
Any other sport.
That's right.
Baseball, football, or ever.
Yep.
And
they date back to the 1500s.
Yeah, they got to go back to Trieste on, Dame, which I tell everybody, when the fly fishing book was a Catholic nun, Dame Julia Burden. And, I don't know whether, the history really lies within the older people.
Yeah.
And I think when these kids get to be older, and I see that they will reflect back on what it is. But I have another grandson who's 9, who's fascinated by World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Each kid discovers history its own way, and getting them in the outdoors is harder and harder when so many people live in cities.
Yeah.
But if you look at the cities that do have fishing close to them, Denver probably would be the prime example. There's 27 fly shops within the greater Denver area, which goes a long ways, goes almost to Wyoming and almost to New Mexico. They call the Front Range. And there's every kind of fishing other than saltwater fishing in that state. From warm water, it's probably got in California, it would be the same way, and they would have saltwater fishing. And so.
Well, and I love, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, what discovered for me, I was really fortunate to have been able to travel early in my career. When I first went to New Zealand, I was just in my 30s. They'd never seen anybody in their 30s. They didn't have any fishing lodges. They had a few old guides, and I mean old guides. We're talking 70 years old, like we are right now. And they could do it because you don't go in a boat, you walk. So I was able to find out that there were history in other countries. We think like we own the fly fishing business. And we did because we had enough fly fishing, and so people could build rods and build equipment, where
Yes.
other countries had to rely on, like Australia and New Zealand had to rely on England in the early days. And the British brought a lot of their history there. A lot of people moved to New Zealand and Australia because they either retired from England or their jobs took them that way. And they brought, and obviously in the 1800s, there's no trout below the equator. I find it interesting when you say going into the library. That when I started tying, Mike Lawson had the same experience. You go into a library, check out a book, and try to learn from the book, but we'd take flies apart
Yeah.
and learn to do it that way.
Yeah.
And so when I got the opportunity to write a book, and I wanted to have lots of pictures because there was no pictures. And that's why I did my very first book. And it was aimed towards the West. Little did I know that between the 3 books that I did, that we would sell close to 500,000 books,
Wow.
which makes it no question the best-selling fly tying book on history, but it would challenge. Probably John Garak would probably have sold the most books when you add it all together.
Wonderful.
And a big influencer on people to think back on what fishing really should be: companionship, going to new water, going to water that's hard. You know, it's
One of the
such a
things I think
sport.
is one of the things that I think is fascinating about fly tying actually is it captures the history of fly fishing in many interesting ways. When
Yes.
you research a particular fly, let's go back to the coachman and realize that the Queen of England's coachman was the one that invented that pattern. And then the Orvis family had an influence in making it the royal coachman. What great history is that? And it's all contained in that fly. So I really love dry fly fishing. So my next question to you is, in your guiding, do you like to bring your clients into situations where they can cast dry flies, or are you kind of
Well, first of all, let's get to understand who and what I did.
Sure.
I started the guiding operation in 1967, and by the time 74 came, we had bought a whitewater operation and a scenic operation, float trip operation, and had guides. In 74, my wife said, "This is no occupation for a married person building a family," and you had to figure out what you're going to do in the winter. And so we built a sporting goods store, and we put the fly shop in the sporting goods store. After doing just a fly shop, I realized in that day and age, there was just no way you were going to survive in a fly shop. And I watched Bud Lilly and Dan Bailey. They had built it into a national business, but
Right.
they struggled.
Oh yeah.
It's a struggle. And
It's
so
one of the reasons that I'm interviewing Neil out of a Puget Sound fly shop in Tacoma, because he's closing up. And one of the stories I want him to share with me is, because he's been doing it for well over a decade. What happened? What do you think is going on?
probably worked too hard for very little money.
Yeah.
But let me finish so you understand about the guiding. So we built a guiding operation and built a business. I took in partners, ended up being quite a large business. It was called Jack Dennis Outdoor Shop. And then we bought 2 ski shops, and we set on a goal to build what we hope to be the finest guiding operation around. And I knew I had a lot of people from George Anderson's operation, so the operations in West Yellowstone, and Mike Lawson, who's a very close friend, his Henry's Fork anglers. There were a lot of people to look at, and I don't think there's any finer operation in this day than the Henry's Fork anglers operation. A very tough river to fish, But there's a lot of good operations. You're not going to survive unless you run a good operation. Just
Right, right.
yeah. So anyway, we worked on that. So I didn't do any guiding. I started going to New Zealand and getting hired by countries and started doing lecturing. We built a business with great people. We built a professional fly fishing team that was like the Oakland A's or any of the great football dynasties. We had the people. We had people writing books. We had people, and the other shop that did the same thing was the fly shop out in Redding, California, Mike Michalak's operation. We sent our people to guide in Argentina, Alaska, all over. So our guides didn't just guide there; they guided other places, and New Zealand.
I have a son who lives in Alaska, and he owns a music studio, and he does all kinds of cool things. He's in a band, quite a popular band in Alaska, and so I've fished Alaska a fair amount, having a son up there. Have you fished Alaska?
Yeah, I fished Alaska. There's very little places on Earth that I wanted to fish that I haven't fished.
Good for you.
And the ones that I haven't gone to, I just didn't have an interest in it. But you have to understand what happened to me is that I got involved with New Zealand. Did over 30 trips to New Zealand and started working with their government to build a solid operation for them. We brought over 80 fly shops to New Zealand to teach them why you wouldn't send people that fished Alaska to New Zealand. It was dry fly fishing. It was precise casting. You had to be a caster or you'd be, and there's not a lot of fish. That was a whole different thing. And then I also worked with Australia and I had these wonderful winter occupations. And then I started lecturing and doing TV shows. And so I went with guides all around the world. And the only way I got back into it was later in life, as the operation matured. Well, by the way, was the proudest award that I got for operation was Outside Magazine did a one time only best of everything. It was not based on the year. What was the best rod 2007? What's the best guiding operation? Who made the best mountain boots? All this. And we got the best guiding operation in the world.
It's awesome.
So awesome. I'm really proud of it. And I sold the operation when I sold the businesses. My partner sold the businesses. I sold the operation to my guides. So they had to make it to contest.
The first American Sportsman was actually just a segment on Wild World of Sports, and it was fascinating, and that's why. And I'm not sure that did you get a chance to fish with or meet Joe Brooks?
Oh yeah, I got a chance to know him through Kurt and everything, and then Lee Wolf, who's actually more involved with American Sportsman than Joe Brooks ever was.
Wow.
And but he told me, Rune Arledge came up with the the agony of defeat line.
Yeah.
Well, he looked over. He was directing it, and he looked over at Jorge Donovan, who broke it in tears when Joe Brooks caught the brook trout that won it for the American team, Gowdy, and he said the agony of defeat. It was him crying, and that's where that line came from. Yeah, so I mean, it was Gowdy talked about that show, about how much it spawned, and the first host of the American Sportsman was not Kurt Gowdy, but no, it was God, I hate to do this. My memory gets bad, but the governor of South Dakota.
Okay.
The military pilot.
I can't remember the name either.
He was a spokesman
about that. So
yeah, it'll come to me.
Yeah. So, let me ask you another question. This is just a minor question, but I think our viewers might be interested to know. How many United States presidents that fly fished crossed your paths?
Well, yeah, I mean, probably one of the most prominent ones was Herbert Hoover, which was before my time. But he was my mentor in fly fishing was a guy by the name of Bob Carmichael, who had a shop in Moose, Wyoming. And he convinced Tom Whitcraft, who was it was a national monument, Grand Teton. And he convinced Hoover to come out to fish with him. And Bob Carmichael took him and they worked him over about making it into a national park.
Ah.
And I got some fabulous pictures of the others. So that was one of the first important deals that happened with fly fishing within politics. Eventually, Truman would make it into a national park and then it would be expanded. My grandfather sold his ranch along with Rockefeller selling their ranch, buying the property to make it into a national park. Okay, let's go forward from fly fishing. Gerald Ford was a fly fisherman. I took him fly fishing when he was a congressman.
Okay.
And then when he became president, we had both Bud Lilly and I gave him lessons for the press. It was highlighting what he was doing with Yellowstone Park, and which would lead to some special regulations, which would be earth-shattering. His press or his chief of staff was Dick Cheney, who I had known from baseball. I had played baseball against him, and he says, "I know you from baseball." And so we became friends. And so I've known him since baseball. And of course, he added a lot as a vice president. Carter, of course, was the one, and I got to give Carter one of my limited edition books and sit on the bank and talk with him about fly fishing. And of course, he ended up writing fly fishing books.
Right. Right.
And then Reagan, I didn't really think he was much of a fisherman, but he liked the outdoors, and he came to Jackson.
Yeah.
Almost every president came to Jackson. I mean, Jackson Hole is where people wanted to come, the great beauty. Now, we did give lessons to Bill Clinton. Now, I didn't give him the lesson, but one of my young kids, who's now one of our senior guides, gave him a lesson when he was in high school to him. And another one of my young people that went on to a fishing career took Hillary and the daughter down the river. But he did take a lesson. And of course, Obama took a lesson. And we also had, when he was vice president, we did have George the Senior, and he went with our operation, went fishing. When the guy that still runs our float trip operation, Bruce James, took him down the river because I was at that time taking Don Johnson and Tom Selleck fishing. And so he said, "Look, I want to meet these guys. Can you bring them over there?" And so we had all kinds of, when you're in Jackson, you can't help it. When you had the premier store there, and I mean, we just knew the people. We had all kinds of actors, and one of the greatest people I met who had so much to do. There's so much intricate about how fishing, and little Gowdy had a lot to do with putting fly fishing on the fore with the American Sportsman. Sure. And when I saw when people recognize people, they forget the American Sportsman really put fly fishing into the
on the map, literally. Yeah.
I think and Gowdy also came up. He and I came up with this wonderful idea called the one fly, where he had just come from being in the one fly, I mean, the one shot antelope hunt. And several of the people had suggested, how come there's nothing in fishing like this? And so he started bugging me. And Lee Wolf, who I got to know real early in my life, had written an article, If You Only Had One Fly. And Joe Brooks and all these people put in, and Gowdy picked the muddler minnow. And Lee Wolf picked my royal humpy, which was a real a play on his fly. And
just briefly, I will share with you that about 25 years ago, I gave up fly fishing with anything other than a dry fly. Now I include mergers in that, but I had discovered that the greatest thrill was to have a trout come up and take something off the top. So that's what I became interested in. The reason that relates to what you just told me is I've zeroed in on a handful of flies. As you can imagine, if all I'm going to do is dry fly fish, I can't just wait for a good hatch or I wouldn't be fishing very much. So I have a handful of flies and the muddler is one of them. So is the Adams, especially the way Hans van Klinken ties it. So I've got a handful of patterns. The renegade,
I'm leaning into this story, which will be interesting for you.
Okay, good.
Yes. So Kurt, we're out there. It's 1973, and we fished together. We did American sportsman shows, and we're out there. And imagine he was the announcer that did everything. The World Series. I mean, he worked for 2 different networks. He did the Super Bowl, World Series, college. I mean, did everything.
Yeah.
Bing Crosby tournament, you name it.
Yeah.
And a lot of them had to do with places he could go fishing. Anyway, so we're out there, and he said, "Look, we're going to have a contest." I says, "Okay, we got to have a contest. How about we take Lee's idea of one fly? You pick one fly, I'll pick one fly, and I'll announce it." And I had one of my guides rowing the boat, and here we go down the river. Here's Kurt Gowdy's voice narrating the one fly contest. And he would go back and say, "Let's go to Howard Cosell." He did a fabulous Howard Cosell. And it had different interviews. And he said, "Well, Dennis makes a cast. Oh, he missed the fly." And the people would be going down the river listening. What the heck is going on? And so I came up with the idea of doing a one fly. And I tried to get people interested in it. And we only could pull up 3 teams interested in it. Of one, which was interesting, Robert Redford was on one of the teams, couldn't sell it to anybody. So it hung around till 1986. And we had virtually no fall business. I mean, after Labor Day, you'd have a little bit of the greatest time of the year, but getting
September to October, I think the best times of year to fly fish, actually.
Yeah. So one of my partners said, "Look, you need to develop this. Fly fishing needs a boost." And so we came up with the idea of the Jackson Hole One Fly. It's the 37th year of it, raised over $10 million for stream improvement projects. All the money goes to stream improvement project. We sponsor kids learning to fish, kids seminars, and let's see, 5 cities, I think now, around the Jackson Hole area. But it's grown into this huge event, and one I've really been proud of. But the thing that has made it so important is the winning flies.
Sure.
And how many of them are dry flies?
Yes. And
I
follow it from a distance, but I pay attention.
But anybody that wants to know about it, it's really easy to find. Go on Google and put Jackson Hole One Fly, and you'll get winning flies. It's a fabulous website, and it tells the whole story about how it came into existence. but it has made so many patterns. The Chernobyl ant, and which is used worldwide now. But it was one of the winning flies, and probably a dozen imitations of that, and including my Amy's ant, which is one of the best-selling flies for Umpqua. But it's all about sharing ideas. When developing flies, like Lee Wolf had this idea, and he was trying to do it, and we became very close in the latter part of his life. And I spent a lot of time with Joan. Joan's still alive, and we talk on a pretty regular basis.
That's great.
But he had an idea that he just couldn't put it together, of taking his wolf patterns and make them into parachutes. He said they ride lower on the water, and he just couldn't do it. He was not a accomplished tyer. He could tie. I mean, I hate to say that. He was as accomplished a tyer as he wanted to be for what flies he needed. He believed he could get a fish to take about any fly, and he could prove it. He was very much a man who believed in his ideas and could prove his ideas. And
I thought the para-wing approach was very fascinating, but it wasn't until I saw the Klinkhammer special by Klinken that I realized this is transferable. This parachute issue is transferable to the things that I like best about fly tying. And so now there's not a pattern. I don't care if you're talking about the traditional Quill Gordon. I've tied a para version on it with a
but nobody had done it with Lee's patterns. He wanted to do it, and he was doing plastic and trying to put calf hair into the plastic with the post. And I said, Lee, it can be done. We started working on it. It's called the Para Wolf. Now it's one of the Umpqua's best-selling flies. And what we found out is threads were not getting, or the big problem when we got in small sizes, the threads were too big.
Yeah.
And at that time, there was an 8/0 thread that Gudbrand was making, long before all the great threads we have right now. You got to realize how far we've come.
16. I mean, yeah.
But we were able to do it. A lot of help with Scott Sanchez and his articles on threads and his ideas working for me. He was always.
So did you mostly use calf body hair, or did you use calf tail?
Well, on the only time I use calf body hair is on the really small sizes, 18, and the rest of it, you want the wind to go through the calf tail, and calf hair is too thick. It'll cause your leader to do all kinds of helicopter forms, and so you have to be very careful. It looks good. I mean, if your time flies for looks, but pretty much we found that it was much easier to deal with and much easier to get a good-looking fly. And I'll tell you, Umpqua ties them, and I see other companies that have tried to do it, and it's a frustrating fly. That Mike Lawson's no hackle and this fly, and it can be said about humpies too, that challenge people. I can't tie them well enough to fish for my own needs. I have to get them from Umpqua. So I see right now there are better fly tires now. Now you're talking about the old days.
Yeah.
The fly tires in this generation are so far superior in their skills.
Yeah. I talked on the phone today with Renee Harrop, and he ties some amazing patterns, and I copy him a lot. And I also really like both CDC and some of the artificials, like Zelon is a great material to use in all kinds of manners when you're tying flies, including building a post. So that's, it is fascinating what's going on in terms of great flies available.
But I'll tell you, you got to understand the basic principles of it. there's some great truths. Truths are you got to match the size. Now we're talking with dry flies. Now, I was trying to lead back to where you ask about dry flies and you ask about guiding. Well, at 65, I retired. We sold everything and we started following grandchildren, went to Utah. And during that time of 55 to 60s, Mike Lawson and I both would actually row people for charity. And so we do maybe 5 or 6 trips. So I got back in and I got drift boats given to me. And so I had to, when Cheney became president, he wanted me to row him. I'm in my 50s. And so I had to come out of it. And I had the time to do it because my operation only required that I made sure the people did their job.
Yeah.
And I had the people that I could go and do whatever I wanted, go to the countries, do television shows, do whatever it took. And so it was, I took him and it was fascinating because you got to be able to be a part of the world. And it's hard to be able to get an opinion, what you thought. And what I did realize for the time, the 8 years, how hard it is for any person to get something across. And we look at what's going on now, but I was able to convince him to not do the Alaskan wildlife area. And he went on a 60-minute show, which I was a part of, and said he had changed his mind on it. Well, that was the only problem was that was 3 days before 9/11.
Oh dear.
And 9/11 changed everything.
Of course.
And I was his environmental advisor. And then I was not his environmental advisor because the environment was taking a back seat.
Sure.
And so I went to a lot of fishing and got to go to the White House. I got to see to the West Wing. I was part of his inauguration family.
Wow.
To that. And Liz, I've known since she was a little girl. And of course, she's by the way, you ask about fly fishing when she can cast a damn good line.
That's great.
She's a little busy right now, but
well, I've got 2 more questions that I'd like to explore.
Sure. Anyway, well, let me just finish on the guiding.
Oh, sure.
I got back to the guiding. Doing this, I started to continue it. And I said, well, how about adding to my retirement? And these foundations come up and say, well, what would you charge us if you would we would auction it off. And so for like 8 years, I did nothing but auctions. And then all of a sudden, I had these people begging me to take them fishing. And they had more money than me. So I developed my own clientele that were 96%. When I say of all the fly fishermen out, their skills were 96% out of 100. So I'm dealing with people that can fish, but still, believe it or not, still have deficiencies.
Oh, and I've been a casting instructor for years. The first thing I do is someone who's experienced, I'll ask them to show me their best cast. And I can identify 3 or 4 flaws almost immediately. And then I have to decide, okay, what is realistic for me to help correct in a half an hour or a 45-minute lesson? Because lessons longer than that just confuse.
Well, you understand it. Let me put it to you this way. I did casting demonstration and I did like 7, 8 sports shows a year. And I mean, just casting 3, 4 times. You wear yourself out.
Yeah.
And so this one friend in Denver came up to me and said, look, I got a lot of opportunities. People would come up and say, hey, can you give me a little quick casting assessment, that type of thing. The guy said, look, I have a PGA guy who heads the Celebrity Cruises PGA program. He's the pro at Cherry Creek or Cherry Hills in Denver. And so I said, sure. This is a really good friend, and he had a house on the Henry's Fork, which is always nice to have a house on the Henry's Fork. Sure, I'll give him a lesson. So he gets there, and it's typical golf, the golf pros, big guy, not particularly tall, but and then there's a lot of great golfers that are fly fishermen. Mickelson always stays at the Super 8 in Ashton to fish the Henry's Fork. A lot of incognito guys go out there, and we can leave it at that. But anyway, he said to me, he says, I don't want to take a lesson from you unless you can answer this question. I thought, wow, this guy's pretty friggin' arrogant, Here I'm donating my time. I'm in your top of my field.
Sure, what do you think?
He says, okay, how long does it take you to look at somebody and tell whether they're ever going to be good at it? I said, well, about 3 minutes. And he goes, I'll take the lesson.
Yeah. Well,
you're telling me the same thing.
Yeah, it's always so obvious to me. In some respects, working with a beginner is easier because they don't have any ingrained bad habits. So when they do something a little off, you just say, oh, that's not the right way. This is the right way. And they, oh, okay. And they're fine.
Yeah, but you're dealing with muscle memory. So you have to understand, my daughter's a doctor of physical therapy at Shriners Hospital. She records muscle memory to find out whether they can help children. And there's like only 4 of these labs. She works with her and another guy run a gait lab, which are motion detectors. And everything in fly casting, they can register flow of motion. And so I've worked in that, and it just like your hand, the energy from the rod, from your arm goes into the rod. And it's just simple. If the rod is bent, the energy can't make that turn. Right. So you're losing energy by just simply, it's a simple basic fact. But the problem is, if you're a spin fisherman, all your life you've done that cast. You're going to be the hardest person in the world to teach fly casting to, because you've got to break that habit.
If you're unwilling to figure it out, I actually tell new students, or ask them first about their experience in bait casting or spin fishing, and then I make it clear, I'm going to ask you to do things that aren't the way you think they should be, but you got to trust me. I'm going to get you to be a good fly fisherman. So I want to move on to another brief topic. We're running. We don't have to end any time in particular, but we've been talking.
Break this up into several deals.
I could talk 3 more hours with you. I'm having.
I want to finish the one thing about guiding and dry flies. Okay. So now I'm back. I'm 75, and I've been able to do this for 10 years, and I'm going to do it again next summer. Be able to take trips. I had a little heart surgery, which looked like that was going to be the end of my career of doing that, but it was successful, and I feel better than I did in the last 5 years. So I'm going to continue it. But you know what I fish? Dry flies.
There you go. There you go.
And yet I was known for screamers and all this.
I have a stretch of river in Idaho that I'm fortunately able to get to every year. My wife is an avid fly fisherman too, so we go together.
So is mine.
Oh, isn't that the best in terms of a relationship?
She only uses dry flies.
I like her.
When they don't work, and then she is an aggressive streamer fisherman. Nothing in between.
I reel in my line and say, I'm going back to camp. You keep fishing if you want, but I'm not going to cast anymore because they're not taking dry as near as I can make out. So
I'm the same way.
Good for you.
I think this comes with age. I think dry fly only fishing comes with age.
Yeah.
But I have to admit though, if they're rising and they're feeding, I'll give them a little something under the surface.
Nothing
deep.
Sometimes that's a very good approach. Yeah, swinging a wet fly is one thing that I kind of miss, having become the purist that I am, because I would do the same thing. I couldn't match a particular hatch just because I didn't have the right color, the right size, or whatever. I'd put on a wet fly and swing underneath them, and that would work like crazy. So I
But
like
you
that.
can also swing caddis that are
Yeah,
dries.
yeah,
You can swing
exactly.
crane flies. There's all kinds of other ways to beat that
Yeah.
thing. You can also move hoppers.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there, and we use a lot of ant patterns. And when we say ant patterns, these are Chernobyl type ant patterns, but actually uh, designed to imitate termites,
Yeah.
which people don't realize that the sagebrush of the West has termites, and people end up calling them flying ants. And some of them are really big.
Yeah.
They have their own insects, which you
Each
don't
like
really see.
they
There's
like
not a hatch of them.
yeah, yeah. Let me go to
Okay,
the
go on to your next deal.
this is kind of the closing question, but I'm guessing we'll talk about it for a while because it's fascinating to me. When you were driving, I can't remember where you were going, but you and I ended up on the phone the first time we talked, and you started to tell a bit of a story about sage, and it just fascinated me because of the things that you started to say. Would you talk to me a little bit about your involvement with sage?
Well, it was involvement before Sage. I started out getting to meet the godfather of Russ Peak, the godfather of graphite rods. Russ was an engineer out at the Southern California Brax, the graphite. I'm trying to think what the company he worked for. It didn't make any difference, but he was playing around with it. And Jim Green, who was the rod designer for Fenwick. And there were several other people, Orvis, Beck, and then they were working with Shakespeare. The first the graphite rods they made were using the Shakespeare technology, which were the spiral wrap Hallward process. And so I started working right off the bat with Fenwick, and they went through some changes. Berkeley had bought them. Kurt Gowdy got involved with them, and Jim was working on developing the first graphite rods for them, and they were good. But during that time, I got to meet Tom Morgan of Winston, who was working with another guy by the name of J.K. Fisher, who made golf shafts. And Buddy Tarantino, which I got to know, who probably was the best caster in history, unfortunately died before he got to really get better known. But it was a fascinating a time, and because he had talked to Hardy to make reels with a right hand wind, and that was a system reels, but he was working with J.K. Fisher too, and so he brought kind of everybody together, and Joe started making some of the very first graphite rods for Winston. And he made some fabulous fiberglass rods for Hardy and Winston. Could be some of the finest casting rods that were ever built. Boy, to find one, you got to really look, and you'll pay a fortune for them because there's not many of them left. And I don't know how many people I know go back and say, what is your favorite fishing rod? And it goes back to the fiberglass rods. So anyway, there was a guy who was involved with that by the name of Larry Green, and he was on Bainbridge Island, and he got the idea to do blanks under his own name, which he called Winslow. Where he got that name, I don't know. So the very first sage rods were Winslow blanks.
Yeah.
And then K2, which was involved in fiberglass skis, the Kirchners, father and son, the K for the K2, he had, and got some money for the sale of the ski thing, and went to Larry and said, look, you need a partner. Let's do something with this. And he says, I don't know about Winslow. Well, they were on Sage Boulevard Sage Street. Why not call it Sage? And then Jim Green came over. So they had a whole bunch of greens. And the guy that bought the company from all of them was named Green.
Cool.
And he put it into a foundation.
Confused about which, because I hear the name often associated with Sage, and it's, early days, and
there were too many greens, but they didn't make green rods. Well, they actually did, and that's
later. They started with brown ones. I got a two-weight RPL that I just love. It was one of the earliest Sage graphite rods.
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of light rods. If you want to fish for fish that are really where there's lots of pressure. In fact, I have a YouTube channel called JD's Wide World of Fly Fishing and Fly Tying, which I just started the fall season, and it's all about history and bringing all this library of videos and fly tying that I've got that from 50 years ago.
Wow.
Bringing that back, and I just did one on how to select a rod for presentation. Now, what are the conditions? And that was the lead off program. I just finished it before you and I started talking about learning to use lighter rods for better presentations. And the new 3-weights are really what the old 4-weights. What a 5-weight now is where a 6-weight used to be.
Right, exactly.
All
or
changed.
7-weight even. I mean, there were a lot of trout rods in 7-weight, and now I wouldn't think of using a 7-weight. In fact, my favorite rod is a 3-weight. So,
well, that's why I use the 3-weight all the time. I mean, it's just, but I don't do much fishing much anymore because what I'm doing is taking my friends fishing, and I'm fishing through them. Now they can fish, and I tell them, you want to know why you lost that fish? And they says, don't think I would have lost it too. I'm just going to tell you why you lost it. And so I
theory is always that you lose a fish because it's time to go back to camp. That's all.
Well, we have a great deal because most of the people I take are over 60, and most of them I have some that are older than me, and I'm 75. And we go out in the morning for the tricos and the early hatch, then we go back, take a nap, and go out for the evening hatch.
Yep.
And the rest of the fishermen are using down rigs and nymphing on the bottom, which will reduce your fish, especially in tailwater fisheries. But that's not, to me, I mean, I take nothing away from anybody. That if that's your thing, it helps fly fishing. I mean, where would fly fishing be if we didn't have that type of fishing? If you want to get a beginner fishing, you want to get them into fish. So
right.
Because the steps are, you want to catch the fish, then you want to be able to catch. That term has been overused. When you get older, you want to be a dry fly fisherman and put yourself in difficult situations. So that transition.
I think that folks like you and I, who have a deep passion for the sport, it's almost impossible to not end up being a dry fly fisherman. Not necessarily 100% of the time, but certainly a big chunk of it, because it's so fascinating.
I love Mike Lawson, who I did so many lectures. We were the traveling fly fisherman. I did his videos. We just did all kinds of stuff together. And he always had an assessment about streamer fishermen had names like Bubba and Joe, and dry fly fishermen had fishermen like, first names like Leonard, and he had this great line. He said that streamer fishermen had higher bowling scores, and dry fly fishermen played croquet and played cards. Yeah, and he's one of the few people I know that's probably had one of the most satisfying jobs in fly fishing. And you got to love to write. I mean, there's no such thing as fly fishing books writing. It's good writing is good writing. You can write about ants, you can write about anything as long as it's good and make it interesting. And I think we see that, in the films today. They're doing so many small films on subjects that nobody would tackle before because they weren't big sellers. And
I'm working on my memoirs right now. Basically, the memoirs of a lifetime of fly fishing is the subtitle, and I've been writing it for almost 9 years now. And I keep on thinking of new things that I want to do. Now, I'm not trying to become a professional writer. I'm just trying to share stuff.
You're too old. You're not going to get there unless you write a big novel. That's gonna. Look, I
think you're right. So
I have a group of people just bug me to death. Why don't you write a book on the deals? And I said, I'm not going to. I have only so many years left to live. I'm not going to try to build museums. I'm going to try to write a memoir that's going to take me 5 years. I'm going to go do things. And I'm going to do things with my grandchildren. I'm going to do other things, and I'll do a little. I like the spoken word. I don't like writing. I'm not good at it. Even though I did the books, I had great help. But you've got to really love it.
My story, 3 years ago, I retired. I was into politics, actually. My career was working with the state legislature here in Washington State and various state agencies. And so I got to know all of the political people and dealt with that. And fly fishing was my reprieve. So when I retired 3 years ago, I thought, I'll just go fly fishing all the time. I found out pretty quickly you can't fly fish every single day. So the business that I'm doing now, which includes this podcast and fly tying videos and casting lessons, has given me the opportunity to just immerse myself in the thing that I love the most. And it's been very rewarding, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm going to close this out. But Jack, I got to tell you, I have thoroughly enjoyed talking with you. I could easily talk another 4 hours with you. Maybe we should do it another time. And
happy to do it.
Okay.
You talk about politics. I was chairman of an effort to put the Snake River into the Wild and Scenic, which meant testifying for any bill only allows one person to testify in the Senate. And so I got picked to testify for this Wild and Scenic bill, which, by the way, we got through. Took 8 years, and President Obama signed it into law. It protects all the drainage of the Snake River in Wyoming, which is the upper part of the Columbia, which you're very aware of. And it gave us a chance to manage water. And I'll tell you, I got my real hand in all my life dealing with getting regulations on rivers. The one fly is putting together to how to be able to talk to politicians. And all I told you is I never wanted to be one.
Yeah, they are truly fascinating people. And I had a very good across the aisle relationships, and it's what made my career worthwhile. But some ugly stuff. There's some ugly stuff, I confess.
Well, guess what? Old people have the time to enjoy it. And so there's going to continue to be old people in clubs and in TUs, and there'll be young people, but there'll always be old people. And I will look at this as a different way. They will find their own heroes. They'll find their own people to look up to. And once they've done everything, they'll decide that, hey, maybe going to this stream and being completely beaten and come back with no fish will excite them to say, okay, let's figure this out and try to not jump on a plane and go to the places where it's easy fishing. try challenges. I have great hope for the youth.
Thank you again, and we'll I'm sure talk some more.
All right, take care of yourself.
Thank you,
I hope you get a chance to do some nice winter fishing.